Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Glad you all can hear me. I'm going to be handing it over to Mary, and she's getting ready right now, and then I'm going to record it as well. So good to see everybody here. And you'll see Mary is going to be in the lab, so it'll be exciting to have there's Mary in the lab. Yay.
Hello, Mary.
Hi, Pat. Yeah, sort of position myself by the study collection so I can pull as needed.
It's already recording, Mary.
Okay.
When I upload it after this, I will
Cut off all the nonsense.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if it's going to do it on your machine since you started this. You were on before me. We'll see. But either way, I can help you with it.
I don't know.
Just when you finish up and you're leaving, if it says recording, just leave your laptop running. It maybe takes like 10 minutes to finish.
Okay.
So not too big a deal. I'm looking forward to this, Mary.
Let's see. Got Debbie, who else? And Peggy, Wendy. Excellent.
Morning.
Good morning.
Can you still hear me, Mary?
Yes.
Because my internet connection is unstable. I don't know why.
Mine always is at home. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes because the video it takes so much, sucks so much of the juice.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hey, Wendy.
Hi there.
And Pat, good to see you here. Both Pats. So
Good to see you too, Ben. Matt, I've been having trouble with Zoom. I had to go and get a new version of it uploaded because of my machine, because my machine's so old.
oh wow, okay. You had to go to a Zoom doctor.
Yeah, I had to go to a Zoom doctor, right.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me?
Hi, Debbie. Yes.
Okay, good.
Did you guys want to see the most exciting thing that's happened in the lab this week?
Yes.
Wow.
Oh, there it is. So beautiful.
This is a bamboo and peony plate, which is made by the Davenport Company in England. This is what the Madison's kind of everyday plates and dishes would have been. So we'll talk more about it, but Maurice Craig, who I think is going to be joining us today, donated this to us and dropped it off on Monday. So
Beautiful.
pretty sexy, huh?
And we get to keep it in the lab. There's so many of those in the house now that Elizabeth said, let the lab have it, is a great example. That's exciting, Mary.
Yeah, it's perfect. So we can use it as a teaching tool.
So is that plate a reproduction or is it from the same time period that the Madisons bought theirs?
It's an antique piece.
Okay.
It's an antique piece. So, and it really has very little wear on it, which is pretty exciting. It's really in very, very, very good shape. So it almost looks like something someone hung up on their wall for most of its life rather than used. We're just gonna hang out a few more minutes as people are joining. I also have strategically placed the lab camera this way so you don't see all the mess that's this way or that way. But actually what you can kind of see here is we're prepping to set up a field lab. And this is the supplies to go from here all the way to the sink. So it's going to be quite a haul over tomorrow.
How long have you been able to be back in the lab?
I've only been coming in regularly about 2 mornings a week, just for the past couple weeks. Sort of have come in sporadically other times, but Hannah and Taylor are in occasionally, Chris is in occasionally, but I'm still not in an everyday back here kind of situation. And you know, part of that is we're, as a property, still encouraging everybody to work from home as much as possible. And part of it is managing childcare in the land of COVID. So, but yeah, some of the vessels we were vesselizing and things like that, all the sherds are still sitting out on the table from where they were in March, when we were like, oh, we'll leave this here and get back to it next week.
Yeah, famous last words.
Right.
It's a little bit like a ghost town. It's kind of sad.
Yeah.
It is sad. When I came for Ben's party, I realized how long it had been since I had been there, and I really felt teary.
Oh, I see Leslie's joined us. Hi, Leslie.
Hi there, how are you?
Hi, Leslie.
Good, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. I don't know why I don't have video here. Let's see. This. Oh, there we are. Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, our ceramics put mine to shame. All in one piece.
Yes, intact ceramics. So much more fun.
Just think of how many sherds would come from all those. Just joking,
True,
Leslie.
absolutely, yes.
Let's not try. All right, so it's 12 now, so we'll go ahead and just sort of get started. So like our other type of lunch and learns, this is designed to be really pretty casual. So what I've done to help get us going today is I've sort of, as you can see, for those of you that are familiar with the lab, I've positioned myself next to the SETI collection drawers so I can pull out anything that we need to look at. I also have sort of edited down a little bit the PowerPoint presentation that I use when I'm training staff on how to catalog ceramics, and that a version of it that I use when we are during our lab program, usually in February. But just so overall, the idea of all of this sort of came about is I want to give you tips and tricks in case you have something that you find digging in your garden, or if you have something maybe you inherited or something like that, just to point you in some of the directions that help me figure out what something is when I have just a fragment of it. I think one of the things, as a sort of in the description says, the question that I get asked probably the most is, what is this? Do you know what this is? How old is this? Where does this come from? Is this really something that's interesting? And that goes for all sorts of different types of things. So that's kind of going to be our guide, not only through today, but through these other ones we're going to do over the next couple of months. Some of them are going to be harder than others, like when we talk about rusty metal things in next month sometime. But this one is, I think there's some good kind of tips and tricks to help. I personally almost find it easier to identify things that are broken than things that are whole. And that's because you get a lot of information from the parts of a ceramic that you can't see when they're whole. So that's, I'm not encouraging anyone to break anything, but sort of the archaeologist in me loves it when a broken piece comes out, because I feel like I have more clues sometimes, but also you're missing some other clues. So what I'm gonna do to kind of get started, and what I encourage you all to do, if you have a question, feel free to interrupt and ask. You can pop it up in the chat. You can do whatever makes you feel most comfortable. Again, I'd rather more discussion and less lecture as we go through. But to kind of give us stuff to look at, I did want to, let's see, I'm gonna share my screen with this, yeah. And, all right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So we're going to be talking about all different types of ceramics to kind of pop through this, but this is a lovely piece of a transfer printed earthenware that was made in England. But before we get into that, if you have a piece of ceramic, again, that you dug up in your garden, I recently found a fragment of transferware in my garden, which makes sense because of the age of my house and the property. But my husband keeps finding, or I keep finding, and he keeps asking me why they're sitting on top of the dryer, is I pick these things up and they end up in my pockets and then I wash them. And so I have a lovely collection of whiteware sitting on my dryer right now, all from my backyard. But some of the tools that I always like to have on hand when I have something that I'm unfamiliar with that's a ceramic is a magnifying glass. So one like this with a light on it, but often a jeweler's loupe can be the best for really looking at pastes. The lab training that I got, my director always had a jeweler's loupe around her neck. And so those are always really, really helpful. A laser pointer is really helpful. This one is just at the end of our PowerPoint clicker, but that's really helpful, particularly if you have a whole piece, if you're trying to figure out if something's a porcelain or an earthenware. References are one of the most important things you can have. So websites, social media, books, study collections. I don't expect anyone to have a study collection at home, but if you find one piece in your garden and you hold on to it and you find another piece later, you might be able to compare them to each other. I'm going to show you some of my favorite websites, but social media is not something that should necessarily be discounted. There's a lot of great stuff that shows up, particularly on museum Instagram accounts, Pinterest accounts. A lot of those sites really, some people are putting up some really good things to help give you information, kind of good examples of what stuff looks like. I wouldn't use it as my only reference, but it's a good thing to kind of, if you have no idea where to start, and just start kind of teasing through things that look familiar. Pinterest in particular is one that I end up finding a lot of stuff on. A lot of people that are involved in everything from thrifting and antiquing to archaeologists keep Pinterest pages that are pretty active and well-informed. Books, of course, are incredibly valuable. A lot of the really good resources, some of them can be out of date, some of them can be quite expensive, but they are, of course, you know, your go-to sort of scholarly text. And then our study collection here, of course, is all materials that we have found here, and that's usually the best. A lot of times people, maybe when they're starting an archaeological lab, people want to give them examples of ceramics or other types of artifacts that they found at their house or in their area. But what's most helpful is to have in your study collection things from the place where you are digging. So like I said, if you're digging up something in your garden and you want to compare it to the other things you found in your garden first, is often going to be the most helpful. But your most important tools are your hands, your eyes, your ears, even your tongue and your mouth. All of these little tips and tricks are going to help you figure out what the wear type is, what's going on, and you'll find yourself doing crazy things, flicking stuff and listening to it, licking it, scratching it with your fingernail, all of these types of things that will help give you a feel for what the artifact is. And so much of what we do as archaeologists really goes off feel because we're looking at broken, dirty things. So you kind of get a sense of things using all of your physical senses. So just kind of in the side here, there's an image where it shows two terms I'm going to use a lot. Paste. Paste is what the ceramic is made out of. So if you looked at the side of a broken piece, we're talking about the paste, and then the glaze is the decorative type on top. Some of my favorite resources, a really great place to start is the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Their website is a wonderful place to start because what this link takes you to is a whole directory of other online resources that they use. Some of which I've included here because they're ones I go to a lot. But again, it's always good if you're looking for identifying something that you have that is, is from your state or your area. It's always really good to start with the experts in your local area. So Virginia Department of Historic Resources is great for us in Virginia, but there's other state archaeology offices and Department of Historic Resources in your home state that will have similar resources available. The other website that probably the most heavily visited website that I go to is Diagnostic Artifacts of Maryland, which is a website that's been created by Jefferson Patterson State Park and Museum. Even though this is Maryland, it is incredibly helpful for Virginia. It really covers the whole mid-Atlantic. They have really great information, not only about ceramics, but about other artifacts as well. The one below it is one I used to go to quite a bit when I worked in Florida, but still go to on occasion, is the Florida Museum of Natural History's Digital Ceramic Type Collection. It is a fantastic resource when you're looking particularly at 18th century stuff, but for any of you that live in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, kind of in the deep South, a lot of the resources that are on that website can are really helpful. They're also really helpful for things from coming out of the Caribbean. The Florida Museum of Natural History has now formed a relationship with DAX, which is housed down at Monticello, and so they're really drawing really lovely connections between the Mid-Atlantic and what was happening in a lot of the deep South through the artifacts, which is sort of a new process that they're doing. The next, so I guess I put the Museum of Natural History on there twice because I like it so much. But this picture you have to the side here was created by the City of Boston's Archaeology, and you can get to that actually through the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and through Jeff Pat. They both have it on their web pages. But it's a really lovely kind of quick guide to historic ceramic types, and we actually print these out. It's designed to be a poster and use it in laminated forms for some of the sheets that we sort and pick and do other activities on it. So there's all different types of guides like this, something like this, like a poster, or really great websites with more information. So those are just some of the ones that I tend to go to quite a bit. I'm going to start a little bit. We tend to talk mostly about what we call historic ceramics or even more refined ceramics, but I want to start a little bit about with some of the ceramics that we find locally here that are made by indigenous people or in association with enslaved Africans. So prehistoric ceramics, that's sort of an all-encompassing term for the ceramics that are made by native peoples in the Americas before European contact. And these ceramics are unique and different from the ones that will come over from Europe later. They do not have glaze on them. They are hand-built. They're never going to be wheel thrown. The ceramic wheel was not part of the toolkit that was used to make these ceramics. So they look quite a bit different than kind of the shiny, bright colors that we'll see later on. Ceramics have been made for thousands of years. And in this part, in the Mid-Atlantic, most of our ceramics come from what we call the woodland period, which is the period sort of right before European contact. To identify ceramics that are of native origins, or these prehistoric ceramics, the process is very similar to what we do to historic ceramics, but slightly different. With historic ceramics, we often have records from the manufacturers, from the companies saying, we're creating these things. They also have things, I'm going to use what I showed some of you earlier, this lovely example that Maurice donated this week. It has a maker's mark on the back that tells you who made it. So there's records. So this was made by the Davenport company. So there's records of the Davenport companies, so we can learn things, where they're in business, who they were selling to, where their things were going. With prehistoric ceramics, we don't have that documentary record. So we don't have names in the same way to refer to them. So usually how they're described is by their temper and their decoration. So temper is, if you look at this shirred side that says shepherd in the center of the picture, temper is that stuff that's mixed in with the clay in order to aid in the firing process. And temper can be plant fibers, it can be sand, it can be crushed up shells, it can be little bits of grit or crushed up rock. This one you can see these kind of like little chunks of quartz that are in it. So we often describe prehistoric ceramics by the temper and then by what the surface treatment or decoration. So surface treatment is sort of a texturizing process. Did they press a cloth into it or a cord to give it some sort of texturized process? And then additional decorations could be incising, punctates, any type of painting even on the ceramic. And then any other defining characteristics. So maybe it has a really unique shape or a unique handle, something that kind of sets it apart from a typical vessel. Maybe a really fat rim. So all of those things are put together. And then usually the ceramic itself is named after the archaeological site where it is first identified. Often the archaeological site where it's first identified, sometimes it's named after a natural body of water or some sort of natural land description. Sometimes it's just named after the archaeologist that first found it. So the names are very, so you can see things like Marcy Creek versus something like Shepherd. The names have really nothing to do with the people that made them. They all have to do with the archaeologists who are categorizing them and identifying them. So it's a very different sort of system for how we talk about prehistoric ceramics than how we talk about historic ceramics. So this is just a real quick chart. I'm not going to go through it, but this kind of shows how we go through looking at temper first, then surface treatment, decoration, you get to the wear type, and then you have your dating of it. So sort of the time period. And the time period ranges are quite a bit different. They'll span hundreds of years, if not more, as opposed to something like a historic ceramic, where sometimes you can get it down to as small as 10 or 20 years. Colonoware is how I pronounce it. You'll hear other people call it colonoware. Is a mysterious and complicated and multi-identified artifact. So when I did my training in Florida, we were trained, first of all, everybody calls it colonoware. Nobody calls it colonoware. So we called it colonoware. And what we were trained was that it was native made. So Native American people who were using local materials to make vessels in European forms. So primarily in that context, it would be contact with Spanish colonists where native people are making ceramics, kind of using their ceramic traditions, but in a new form to serve and sell to or trade with the Spanish colonists. The exact same term, but with a slightly different pronunciation often, in the mid-Atlantic and other parts of the South take on a different meaning. Again, local materials, so local clays and sources, often made by enslaved or free enslaved Africans and African Americans, most often by enslaved people. Usually, again, using local materials, but in forms more similar to African vessel forms. So it is made by enslaved people generally for their own use, not for use of white people. So that's also kind of a difference. Another complication is that sometimes it's made by both for trade. So sometimes it's made by native people and enslaved Africans at the same time in the same general area. It is a poorly defined term because it applies to so many different interpretations. And so when someone mentions that they have colonoware or colonoware, you have to ask them more questions after that. Because wait, who made this? Why did they make it? Was it for their personal use? Was it to making it for somebody else? Why is this being made here? And really, the one thing that unifies it is that it's local materials made for a local purpose. And so whatever that is, whether it's a white person using it or a black person using it or an indigenous person using it or making it, it's local materials for a local purpose. That's like the one thread that connects through all of those different interpretations. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, it tends to have what's called this fire clouding. So if you look in this picture of the almost whole vessel, it has this kind of black spots on it on the side where it's intentionally sort of charred on the outside as sort of a decorative for treatment. It's often very plain and doesn't have some of the more complicated decorations that we see of the prehistoric ceramics. However, in very small forms, it is really hard to tell the difference often between a piece of colonoware and a piece of Native American ceramics, particularly in the context of a place like Montpelier, where usually these are found just maybe 1 or 2 pieces a season, and they're mixed in with things from other contexts, with European ceramics. So if you're on, you know, a woodlands period site and you have lots and lots of examples, it becomes much more easy to identify. Or if you're on a site with a lot of colonoware where they're producing the colonowares, you'll have a lot of good examples. At Montpelier, we don't have any evidence of colonoware being produced here on the property. So the examples that we have are very few and far between, and makes it a little harder to tell the difference. Particularly if you're at a site like the Overseer site where you're in plow zone and everything's churned up together and you don't have those nice stratigraphic layers in the same way. It also can be really crumbly. So for historic ceramics, we have 3 big types, and we call these ware types. And this really, they separate themselves really by the paste. So earthenwares are things like the majority of our transfer wares you see. I'll pull out an example here. This is a coarse earthenware. There we go. You can see it's got this one. This is a piece of French faience. It's got kind of a pinkish paste to it. It's thick, it's chunky. It's fired at a low temperature. Don't do this if you're around other people, but because I'm by myself in the lab, I'm gonna lick it and it is gonna stick to my tongue. Because it's fired at these lower temperatures, it won't stick quite as well as bone, but it will stick pretty well. The next sort of temperature of fire are stonewares. They're much harder. They're fired high enough at a temperature that even without glazing, they are watertight. They don't absorb the water, unlike earthenwares, which when you lick it, it will absorb it if there's no glazing on it. And then our porcelains, which are fired at the highest temperature, and they get that sort of viscous, beautiful, delicate look to them. So when people talk about ceramics, they'll often call them all china, or they'll call it all porcelain, when quite often what the piece that they might actually be speaking about is an earthenware or something very different. When your laser pointer comes in handy is to tell that difference between porcelain and earthenware if you have a whole vessel and can't lick it. So coarse earthenwares, these are sort of a workhorse ceramic. They're often used for these big, sturdy vessels for prepping and cooking food. So milk pans, stirring bowls, big kind of heavy things. They often have a red buff or sort of pink paste like the piece we looked at here. They're really thick. The unglazed ones, if you think of it like a terracotta flower pot, they're intentionally unglazed. That's great. It absorbs the water, which allows over time kind of for the plant to do better. The glazing allows you to put a liquid in a coarse earthenware vessel. So often you will see, so on this piece we have glazing on both sides, but often in a coarse earthenware vessel, you'll only see glazing on the inside of the vessel. And that's again to put, to be able to put liquids in it. It's less about what it sort of looks like on the back and more about the functionality of the glaze. So if you have ever seen an olive jar, like a big olive jar, which was sort of the brown paper box of the 1700s and into the 1800s, they're often just glazed on the interior and no one would have even been able to see that unless it was broken. This is a tin glazed piece here, but there is also the majority of coarse earthenwares are lead glazed. My personal favorite are these tin glazed coarse earthenwares. You can also scratch the coarse earthenware with these tin glazes with your fingernail, and a tiny bit of that paste will chip off. You can stick it to your tongue. The faience glaze is very thick, like an M&M shell. But this is a British-made coarse earthenware called Delft. Sort of hold it up there. Do you see how the glaze is chipping off? It will just flake right off of these pieces. And so that's often a signature way to identify the Delft. There's also Dutch Delft as well. It is very difficult archaeologically to tell the difference between Dutch and English Delft just based off these kinds of techniques. Refined earthenwares are what, when you come to Montpelier, this is what you see 90% of the time. This is sort of the bread and butter of ceramics during this time period. So our period of interpretation, which is that Madison retirement period, this is the heyday of these refined earthenwares, but even extending through the earlier Madison periods and later, we'll really just find tons and tons of this stuff. Like the coarse earthenwares, the majority of the coarse earthenwares that we have here are English made, although I showed you an example of a French, and there's some Dutch, and of course there are Spanish made ones as well. We don't get them up here, but they're really pretty. But these refined earthenwares are primarily English made that are coming here. England had almost a monopoly on the ceramic trade. They really were able to produce a lot of high quality, affordable wares that went all over the world, not just to their own colonies, but all over, all across South America, North America, the Caribbean, all over. You find these things kind of everywhere, which makes them excellent for dating and understanding trade patterns, all sorts of things. They're white, they're thin bodied. I'm gonna pull out a piece right here. Example I have, this is a hand painted one. So you can see it's much thinner, but still sort of an off-white paste. It'll still stick to my tongue, but not as well. I won't be able to scratch it with my fingernail, but that sort of off-white or buff color really is gonna give me a good indication that it is a refined earthenware. Refined earthenwares have a million different decorative types, a million different forms and functions, so they're kind of the everything type of ceramic. We're gonna get more into all of that stuff, but among refined earthenwares, we break into kind of three primary ware types, which are creamwares, which are sort of the oldest ones, and creamwares are, got one right here, so called because they're cream in color. So this is a lovely feather-edged piece, molded little plate. Their paste is very cream looking, but they look very, very cream, just colored. And it ranges from almost like a buttery yellow to a very light off-white. Pearlwares, for us and for our period of interpretation here, pearlwares are the thing we find a ton of. Really having sort of the bulk of their use in that early 19th century. So again, this little piece that I showed you earlier is a pearlware. This is part of a little, I think it's part of a tea set. They've added a little bit of cobalt to the glaze to give it sort of a bluish color. And sometimes a pearlware can look very white and shiny. Sometimes it has sort of a bluish or tint to it. Most often you can see at the bend of a vessel, sort of by a foot ring or any sort of bend, a pooling of blue. And that will give you a really good clue that it's pearlware. Pearlware glazes often craze, which means they crack in a unique way. So you'll get these tiny, tiny, tiny little crazing cracks that you see on pearlware. Not on all of them, but it's sometimes a really good clue. For whiteware, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's white. It looks the whitest. Its paste is the whitest. It has some of the brightest color decorations on it. But the best thing I like to do is to take my three pieces, a whiteware, a pearlware, and a creamware, put them on a bright white sheet of copy paper, And that's when you can really see, is it white? Is it sort of blue? Is it that little bit of off-white? If you're digging around here, you really need to make sure that your ceramics are clean because of the color of the clays here. The red staining can make things that are white look more off-white. So you really have to make sure that you've used your soap and water, or not soap, but your water and your toothbrush, and gotten all of that dirt off to really do that. But once they're cleaned really well, that white paper test is the best thing you can do. So when we're sorting things out, what I do is I have a bright white sheet of paper that I always have every single staff member work on so they can spread things out and do that comparison. Otherwise, you'll make yourself crazy going, is this slightly off-white? Is this a little off-white? But the truth is, if it's teeny, tiny, tiny, and you can't tell, it's not going to change our interpretation of the sites. Ironstone is a type of whiteware that's really thick and really heavy. Sometimes you'll hear people call it hotelware, because if you think about those big, thick, heavy plates that are used in diners or hotels, in order so they don't break, so they're very heavy. I always think of like Steak and Shake plates. I don't know if you all have eaten at Steak and Shakes, but they're heavy, they're thick, they're solid, they're bright white. Sometimes they have a light gray to blue tint to them, but again, it's this really sturdy version of a refined earthenware. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Just that I always have trouble telling whiteware from creamware if it's dirty.
Yep, absolutely. And I think what's great about that is it shows that every task that we do in the lab, whether you're doing the final analysis or the very first person to clean the artifact, they're each so important, because you can't do step 3 if step 1's not done right.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's just so important of why working as a team and working with volunteers and working with expeditioners is so important for us to do the kind of work we can do. Because if the artifacts aren't clean, we can't get it done.
Mary, when you were trying to determine what's what, do you look at temper?
Only for
is that only for prehistoric?
Only for prehistoric.
Okay.
So that you don't see in refined earthenwares or any of these historic mass-produced ceramics, you don't see temper in the same way you do with prehistoric ceramics. It's really just the paste is so much finer, and it doesn't have any of those big kind of chunks in it. It's also fired at a much higher level, and it's a much more, I would say, like exacting combination of clays and specific clays and sands to do it. So you'll sometimes see with a coarse earthenware things that look like temper or that are basically functioning like temper. But generally speaking, when you're archaeologists don't use temper for historic ceramics for any of the descriptions or identifying factors.
Thank you.
That's a great question. So talk a little bit about parts, form, and function. There's lots of different vessel parts, but some kind of ones that are real helpful for places to know to just kind of help with your vocabulary. There's lids, rims. We talk a lot about rims. So rim can be on a plate, it can be on a bowl, everything's sort of that outward edge. The marley, that's the bend. So if we, again, look at our whole version here, this bend right here between the rim and, I know it's a little shiny, but right along here, this is our marley, is that bend in the plate. And that's for plates, soup plates, any of these kind of flatware pieces will have that kind of marley. The body is what we talk about. That's sort of the default piece. If you can't identify a piece as being part of a specific part of a vessel, we always just call it the body. Handles, we all know what handles are. Spouts for like a teapot or a pitcher. The base, of course, is the bottom. The foot ring is what, not every vessel has a foot ring, but what the base is sitting up on top of. And then a glaze chip is when just a fragment of glaze shows up. So, oh, thanks, Debbie. I just realized that I'm still sharing screen, so you can see what I showed. So here, marley here. So we've got our rim, our marley, I would call this the base, and then our foot ring around here. Thank you. And then I see from Mark, when we reconstruct pieces, do we use the same adhesive? So the adhesive we use when we are reconstructing is a chemical called B72. And B72 is what we use for a lot of things. It's also what we use to label ceramics. It's a acetone solvent chemical. In a lot of ways, it's very chemically similar to clear nail polish. And it can be removed easily with acetone without causing any damage to the ceramic. It's a pretty, depending on the concentration of the B72 to acetone, which is kind of how we water it down, it can be very thin, almost like a top coat, or it can be pretty thick as we would use it for glue. But it's a pretty weak bond, relatively speaking, much weaker than something like super glue. And that's because we never want the bond to be stronger than the material itself. So if we were gonna glue some pieces together, we would want to make sure that if I accidentally dropped that piece that I just glued together, that it broke where it was already broken and wouldn't break in new spots. The worst thing you can do whenever you're doing any type of conservation is to use like super glue or something that's so strong that if you dropped that plate again, those pieces would hold together and it'd break in all new places. So you could really destroy a piece by doing that. B72 is also really nice because it doesn't discolor. It doesn't have some of those other things that other adhesives, sort of over the counter drugstore adhesives might do. It also is great because if you make a mistake, you can just soak it in acetone and an acetone bath, and the adhesive will come apart without having to cause any damage or prying, and you can reshape or maybe you found a new piece, reattach. So that's what we do because our focus is really on conservation. And it's the same approach that sort of preservationists and archaeologists do in cemeteries when they're doing headstone reassembly or any type of other thing where we want to make sure that in case any future damage happens, that it happens where it already exists and not in a new spot. Great questions. Keep them coming. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Generally speaking, we talk a lot about form and function. Flatwares are your relatively flat things like plates, platters. Hollowwares are things that hold something, bowls, cups. And that's just a good way when you have just a tiny piece and you may not be able to say, I know for sure that this is a dining plate or a dessert plate, but you could say, I know it's something that's flat. Or hollowware, I don't know necessarily if this is a bowl or a cup, but I know it, the shape of it tells me that it held something. We also break things out into what their function was. What are they used for? Are they used on a dining table? So what we would call tablewares, that's your plates, your platters, tureens, other kinds of serving vessels. Your teawares, everything you need to have tea. So cups, pots, saucers, sugar bowls, those types of things. Tavernwares, those are exactly what they say, the kinds of wares that were commonly used in taverns of the period. So they're often large mugs, big sort of bowls where communal food is served. Toiletwares, what they sound like, things you use when you're in the bathroom. So that can be a chamber pot, but it could also be like a soap dish or something along those lines. Utilitarian wares are kind of a catch-all term for a lot of other things. So that can be storage vessels, milk pans, things for storing food, processing food, or other items, kind of your big heavy duty stuff. The thing with ceramics is it's such a great material. They used it in the past for so many different things. If you think of everything we use plastic for today was probably made out of ceramics in the 1700s and 1800s. So when we have these refined earthenwares, because we find so many here, we like to break things down into their decorative types. So these are specifically, I'm talking about refined earthenwares, but they show up for almost every other type as well. This is just a quick quote of why we organize things archaeologically by decorative types. And what it basically says is in the historic documents, when merchants and importers and the manufacturers are talking about what they are producing, they are not just, they are primarily described by how they are decorated, not by their wear type. And this is very different. So when this article was printed and published, and sort of this idea was put forth to say, hey, archaeologists, focus more on decoration and less on wear type, it was pretty counter to what archaeologists had been previously doing. A lot of archaeologists only talked about wear type. They would just say it's creamware, it's pearlware, it's whiteware, and then kind of stop there. And part of that was a bias towards not being that interested in stuff from the 17 and 18 and early 1900s. So archaeologists often weren't trained to identify the materials any more deeply than that. So if you went and worked for a contract firm, you were maybe very heavily trained in Native American spear points or ceramics, but didn't really have a really good working knowledge of historic ceramics. So if you could just do that quick, it's whiteware, pearlware, creamware, clump it into a category, and then keep it moving. But sort of the rise of historic archaeology and really people realizing how much information really could be gained from the ceramics really caused a pivot for people to start looking more at decoration types. So much of this too is really biased by, again, where you're working and where you're trained. So I can give you an example. When I worked in Florida, I was working on Spanish sites that are contemporaneous to Montpelier throughout its lifetime. And we would refer to any sort of refined earthenware as just imported stuff. It was just imported. We imported anything. We didn't tease out if things were American made or English made. We didn't really even talk that much about decoration. We were so focused on the Spanish produced mahalicas that we just kind of ignored everything else because everything else was in such small percentages. And then when I came up to the mid-Atlantic, all of a sudden there was all these other categories that I had always lumped into one big category working in Florida. So it was a really kind of new experience to look at the exact same time periods, and in some ways the exact same material, but approach it from a different context and ask different questions. So again, sometimes it's where you're trained, sometimes it's where you're working, sometimes it's just the questions that you're asking. These are my favorite, even still, even though one of our lovely expeditioners calls them torture wear, because trying to put them together is a bit of a nightmare. I love these tortoise wares. You'll hear them called a bunch of different names. Sometimes you'll hear them called Wealden or Wealden Wedgwood. I was trained initially to call them clouded creamwares, but tortoise is a great catch-all. And the tortoise description really comes from, they're these brown, yellow, and green kind of tortoiseshell colored decorated wares. This is what James Madison's mother had. This was her stuff. And when she would have gotten it, if she, right around the time when James Sr. and Nellie Conway, James Madison's mother, married, this stuff was at the peak of popularity and fashion. She just held on to it and kept using it long after it went out of fashion. But she had this stuff, and I think that's just so wonderful. And it is such a contrast to think about, this is what's in fashion in the 1760s, and then this is what's in fashion in the 1820s. Very different look, which I think is fun. We have our edgewares. Those really refer to the things where they just primarily have the decoration around the edge of the vessel. So sometimes people will call all of them shell edge. Many of them are shell edge, but they're all different types of edge decoration. The feather edge, as you see here, the shell edge, but also kind of embossed, really like beautiful decorations. Slip decorated. What a slip is a watered down version of clay. So they water down sort of a colored version of clay and then paint that on to a ceramic, and then often also use glazes as well. Identifying sort of a slip decoration, often you can see the slip is sort of raised from the rest of the decoration. You can kind of feel it. This is the kind of common decorative type for these tavernwares, these big mugs, these big pitchers, these big bowls, really quite lovely. You don't find a ton of it here, but we do find it, and when we do find it at Montpelier, it's almost always in the enslaved context. This is not something the Madisons would have put on their dining table. the hand painted every type of ceramic, ranging all the way from the prehistoric period all the way into stuff that's produced today. You can still have hand painted stuff. It is very common, of course, for refined earthenwares, but also for Chinese export porcelains. That's sort of the primary design. We have our transfer print designs. These really are in their heyday. Again, during our period of interpretation, so we find a ton of it. The bamboo and peony plate I showed you is an example of transfer prints. We have an amazing collection of transfer prints. Leslie, how many would you guess, how many patterns would you guess that we've identified? Sorry, she's on mute, so I should have prepped her.
I think we're up to about 70 or 80 different patterns here, but I also identify Colonial Williamsburg, and we're up to 143 different patterns there. So as you say, the British potters were prolific. They were looking to make designs that are going to be of great appeal and very trendy. And so with a variety of wares available, there were many hundreds of patterns, or really thousands and thousands of patterns produced. So I'm sure we'll find a lot more here.
Absolutely, thank you. And what's really fun about these is because of the nature of the design of these, you often get like a full picture as opposed to the hand painted or some of these other where it's more, it's less consistent. So the joy of the transfer designs is often you feel like for the first time when you're trying to put the pieces together, you might have the lid of the box of the puzzle to kind of guide you, which is often not the case for some of the other ones. Now you have to figure out which lid it is, which is sometimes quite difficult, but it can be really helpful for trying to vesselize those. And then let's see, I think we have another question. Let's see if I can see our chat. Hold on just a second. It didn't come up.
There's one question. It's
Sorry.
from me to Leslie. I was just curious, how many crossover patterns have you found between Montpelier and Colonial Williamsburg, Leslie?
A very good question, Matt. And I will just say that I am in the process of doing a comparison, doing spreadsheets where I'm putting the patterns that I found at various sites side by side, just to see what the comparison is. So I will I will get an answer to you soon.
Very cool. Thanks.
That's really cool. It is really fun when you go into someone else's lab, and this happened when I was at Monticello's lab one day, and they actually were in the middle of cataloging ceramics from the Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's site. So if you can imagine, here I am representing Montpelier at Monticello, looking at ceramics from the Hermitage. So 3 presidents right there. And I looked down at one of my colleagues' desk, and there, sitting there, was a fragment of a piece that we had the exact same pattern here at Montpelier. So it's really fun when you kind of can make those connections across sites. One of the other types of decorations we have is molding. You can have different types of molding, sort of a relief mold or what's called a sprig mold. So if you think of those, the jasper that I said, the sprig molding is that what I think of as like a stereotypical wedge with the blue with the white sort of relief design on it. And then the applied molding is sort of similar, but if any of you remember some of those dry-bodied stoneware teapots we have, those have the relief molding. And then usually the decoration is put under the glaze. That's the best way to do it. It's really well protected, but sometimes you have to put decoration on top of the glaze. Sometimes you have to because things like gilding, so that gold rim, that gold design like you see in the NASK piece right there, can't survive the high firing temperatures. So it has to be painted on afterwards. Sometimes it's personalization, sometimes it's just sort of how things are manufactured. The hard part is archaeologically, those designs wear off incredibly easy after being through use, but also being thrown out and then kind of having dirt all over them. So often all we see remaining of those is what we call a ghost, which is almost like when you pull off a sticker and all that's left is the sticky residue. That's what a ghost looks like. It looks like a white textural difference in the shape of what the design had been. So sometimes you'll think you have a totally plain, undecorated piece, and then you hold it up to the light, you rock it back and forth, and then all of a sudden you see these little white on white flowers. It's really exciting. It makes it really difficult to try to put those pieces back together because you're constantly rocking it back and forth trying to remember what the decoration was. But when I'm looking at those and trying to mend those, you'll see I'll have an array of sticky notes where I've drawn out by hand what each of the designs is and the piece next to it, so I can sort of keep track of it. So you'll see little chains and flower chains and all sorts of designs. There's all sorts of other kind of variety of designs. One of my favorites is the crumb applique, which is what you see in the center here, where little bits of ceramic are kind of ground up and stuck to the side. It's a really good way to add texture. Sometimes when you're making almost like figurines in the shape of animals, they often did this crumb applique to make them look furry, which is sort of funny. The copper luster, there's also a silver luster, which is application to basically trick the eye. So someone might think you have silver candlesticks or a copper vase or some other sort of fine metal when you really have a ceramic piece that's been covered with this, which is really kind of wonderful. We talked all about refined earthenwares, got into decoration, but we have still our other ware types. So of course, our stonewares. We have, like we had with earthenwares, we have coarse stonewares and refined stonewares. For those of you, this is very funny because I talk a lot with my hands and I realize no one can see me talking with my hands as I do this. But the refined and coarse stonewares are used very similarly to refined and coarse earthenwares, where the coarse ones are more utilitarian, using often to store food or processed food, while the refined stonewares are used for more like tablewares and serving, teawares, things like that. So our refined stonewares are white salt glazed stonewares, when you're going to see a lot. A good trick for stonewares, again, remember, it's not going to stick to your tongue, but if it's a very bright white and you look at the piece and the texture of the piece of the glaze almost looks like an orange peel, these tiny little divots in it, that's going to be a salt glazed stoneware. You rock it back and forth, catch the light, and it will show that sort of orange peel-like texture, which you can even see in that picture of the one on the top. The majority of glazing for stonewares is salt glazed. So even on the coarse even on the coarse stonewares, you're going to have that texturizing in the glaze. Sometimes you will have a stoneware that is not glazed, like the ones you see at the bottom here, which are these dry-bodied stonewares that are very smooth. They kind of have a matte look or dull look to them, but they're really beautiful, and they're so they're fired at such a high temperature that even without a glazing, they are watertight, so they can be used for things like teapots. And we have really two beautiful examples here in the lab of a black basalt, so a black dry-bodied stoneware teapot, as well as a red dry-bodied stoneware teapot. And the red one, it's hilarious. It's English made, but it has designs on it that are meant to look Chinese, and including a fake Chinese character maker's mark on the bottom. That's not even a real Chinese character. It's just like a nonsense thing, which is kind of lovely. The white salt glazed stonewares have various rim designs that can also give you a clue of what they are, but what can be very complicated is these same molded rim designs that are used for white salt glazed stoneware are often used for the tortoise wares, as well as cream wares. So the one you see on the side there, the barley, we have barley in white salt glazed stoneware, we have barley in tortoise, and they also made barley in creamware. So they're using these same mold designs for these three different ware types, so they can all be used on the same table together, because although they're not matchy-matchy, they all go together using these same sort of rim shapes, rim designs, and molded designs, which gives that eye a little bit of a break if you have all that tortoise. And then, of course, porcelains. This is actually one of my favorite slides because of the pictures down at the bottom, because you can really see the difference in the pastes, where the earthenware pastes look grittier and more off-white, and the porcelain paste looks smoother and a pure white. They're non-porous, they're almost glass-like, they're vitrified. You can use your laser pointer to shine through on a thin piece of porcelain. You'll see the laser come through the light, and you'll never see that on an earthenware. So if you're trying to tell the difference of a whole vessel, a laser pointer is a really big help. They're usually quite thin and very hard. The majority of the porcelains we find here are Chinese export porcelains. So these are porcelains that were specifically made in China to be exported for the Western market. So not just the Americas, but also into Europe. So what's really cool about Chinese export porcelains is they are abundant, but they are also, the Chinese market fashioned itself really to meet Western needs. So sometimes they're making vessel forms specifically for the Western diet, to accommodate the Western diet that would not be appropriate to accommodate the Chinese diet. You're doing all these really interesting things. Also here at Montpelier, we find European porcelains, primarily French porcelains. The three that we have are the Nast, the Daguerty, and the Sèvres. And those are named after sort of the manufacturers of them. The Nast is what is often referred to as Madison's sort of presidential china. That's the one in the center of the slide, center bottom. It is an overglaze, so it is very hard to kind of see it in its glory from an archaeological sample. But it was, during the Madison's time period, presidential china was not a thing that was official. But this was definitely something that the Madisons brought with them to Washington after the burning of the White House, and then brought back with them to Montpelier. And we know this because of the contacts and the stratigraphic layers we find it in archaeologically, which is pretty exciting. And then of course, here's our Chinese porcelain. Again, more of the European porcelains. The one on the bottom right that looks sort of like a trellis in green, that's the Daguerty. We have a tea set of that in the main house. The picture directly above it that just looks like little blue dots is actually what the Daguerty looks like for us when we find it in the ground. That's how much has been worn away off the decoration, and the rest is really just those ghosts that I talked about. Same with the center design is another example of an overglazed porcelain, kind of what it looks like in perfect form, and then to the left what it looks like when we find it. So I want to just kind of stop here. We only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to get back here. But does anybody have any questions or thoughts or pieces of their own that they're like, wait, what is this?
Well, I have a ton of stuff from China that was bought by my grandmother when she was a missionary living over there in like the 19-teens and 20s. But it's almost too much to try to do anything with here, but I would love to know more about it. If you can you recommend any reading or websites?
So let's see. I'm trying to think if Leslie, if you know of any. I was going to say the majority of what we so it's a little different because if she bought it in China, it's going to be different than the Chinese export that we find here, because it's going to be and you said 19-teens. So for Chinese, made for Chinese use, Leslie, do you have any recommendations that you can think of?
There are many reference books, as you say, for the American market or for the export market. As far as the ones for use in China, but what you have quite possibly was made for the European market or for the American market, because the forms that we would use are entirely different than the tableware forms that the Chinese would use. So if the forms you have look like our regular tablewares and teawares, then they probably were made for export, and in which case any of the books that are available right now. Ron Fuchs did a wonderful one. He is the curator at the Reeves Center at Washington and Lee University. Winterthur has put out some good books. I think you can go online, and a number of good books are available on Chinese export porcelain, and a number of them are also available either for purchase or are available online as well. So I think you can get a lot of good information about the tablewares you have from these references. I
would double down on sort of Ron's book. It is beautiful and has some of the best pictures. So even if you ended up with that book and it wasn't helpful, you would end up with one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen.
Can you give the name and author again, please?
Oh, I'll get it.
Thanks, Leslie. I see Mark has a question. So the reference for the city of Boston, that picture, it is available online at the Jefferson Patterson State Park Museum. It is also, you can get to it through the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. It was made by the city of Boston and then just sort of distributed by the gentleman that made it. And I don't think they ever actually posted it themselves. Hey, ma'am. It's good to see you. Does anybody else have a quick? Yes, this is the book. So if you all can see Leslie.
Yes. And it's called Chinese Export Porcelain in the Reeves Center Collection by Ron Fuchs, Fuchs, which is an excellent book. And it talks a lot about both the forms themselves and the decoration and many wares that were made for high-end clients with their armorial crest on it. So that's a good one. Another one I can recommend is this one by Jean McClure Mudge, M-U-D-G-E, Chinese Export Porcelain in North America.
And I'm wondering too, Debbie, for the stuff your mother bought, it may also be grandmother. She may have also bought it at like a tourist market where it was being sold specifically, because I don't know where she bought it. So it may have been something that was being produced and not necessarily going to export, but to be sold to tourists or Westerners. So that's
yeah,
we see that whenever we travel.
Would you mind if I took a couple of pictures and sent them to you?
No, not at all.
Okay, thank you. I know that this is of interest to nobody but me.
No, but it's actually a great question because a lot of times people do send me pictures. And here's some clues for if you want us to look at pictures of things. A good way to do it is you want to have the front. So I'm going to start with this. You want to have the front. You also want to have the side because we want to see the angle here. If it's a fragment, we want to see the paste. The paste is so important. You want to have the back. If there's a maker's mark, but sometimes it may not be something as obvious as this. Sometimes there could be some other little mark, evidence of how it was fired. There's all sorts of information on the back. Even if it looks just plain, still send a picture of the back. When you send a picture, put something in there for scale, a ruler or a coin, something, not your hand. I don't know how big your hand is, but a ruler or like a quarter. That's really helpful because that helps me understand, is this a tiny little vessel or a really huge big vessel? Because even on something like those edgewares that are very, very common, I personally own one piece that's this big, a little plate. And if you didn't have the scale in, you would think it was a regular dinner plate. It was something that was made for kids. So if you ever sending an archaeologist or an antiques person, something like this, always make sure you have those different angles. If there's a decoration element, you may want to take a whole picture and then zoom in on particular decorations. More pictures are always better, but really the side, the front, the back is a really a treasure trove of information.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions?
Hey everybody, I'm going to sign off and I've transferred the host to Mary, but if it goes dead, it's because I'm very rude and I apologize, but it should just go to Mary. So good seeing everybody and thank you, Mary. This is wonderful.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks,
Bye.
Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
If I could just offer a couple of other tips.